In our ever-changing world, it's hard to keep track of all the demographic oddities and quirks that build an increasingly vivid narrative and picture of historical events, as I've discussed in the past, such as the Polish village in Haiti or the former Jewish homeland on the border with China. But there are virtually limitless possibilities as to where history could have taken a turn in the past few centuries alone. And indeed, even hundreds of years ago, men surmised or perhaps fantasized over the alteration of major historical events, with the story of Taran Leblanc, written by Joannet Martorell in the 15th century, quite possibly being the first alternate history scenario actually put to paper, that being a story in which Constantinople never falls to the Ottoman Turks due to a valiant knight from France. However, I prefer not to fantasize nor romanticize the past, only discuss topics that I find intriguing, but it should be quite telling that the three most common alternate history scenarios prevalent in the English-speaking world today concern the American Revolutionary War, the American Civil War, and without a doubt World War II, which makes sense considering that these three events carry some of the strongest emotional weight of any conflicts in history, despite taking place generations ago. Today, however, we will not be discussing these monumental events in world history, but rather a few abstract situations which I believe have not been fully fleshed out, but are definitely within the realm of possibility. So here in Texas, when I was in high school, I remember a certain teacher telling us that the illustrious Chinese explorer Zheng He was actually the first outsider to discover America in the 15th century, not Columbus. And through the years this has been debated, and aside from a first few sensationalist articles, there is very scant evidence pointing to this Chinese discovery of America, especially not Zheng He himself. But what if he did? Zheng He was quite possibly the single most distinguished Chinese explorer in history, attaining a near godlike veneration among some today, and it is without question that he led a fleet of nearly 30,000 men halfway around the world, consisting of some 250 ships, some larger than a football field, although there are many myths and tall tales surrounding his expeditions. One of Zheng He's more intriguing ventures was his Indian Ocean expedition, lasting several years in the early 1400s, visiting several diverse locales such as the Malay Archipelago, Bengal, Sri Lanka, Oman, and Mecca. Although interestingly, while exploring the Swahili coast, a small contingent from the fleet became lost in a storm and ended up shipwrecked in Pate Island in modern Kenya. The surviving 20 or so Chinese sailors actually ended up converting to Islam and marrying into the local Swahili community, and from modern DNA tests it has actually been concluded that a handful of islanders actually still carry trace amounts of Chinese DNA some half a millennia later. This goes to show the sheer magnitude of the radius of exploration for the Ming Chinese and how incredible it is that they could make a new life for themselves so far away from home, although it is likely that Zheng He's own Muslim faith is what drew him towards Mecca and the Arabian Peninsula in the first place, but it really is possible that perhaps with a bit of luck, Zheng He or a lone boat set adrift could have gone off course and stumbled upon the New World. It really is possible, considering that ancient seafaring Pacific Islanders may have reached the American mainland in the past using nothing greater than Bronze Age technology, and admittedly the whole thought that China and other East Asian nations were far more technologically advanced than the Europeans or Middle Easterners at the time is not entirely a myth, as 12th and 13th century Ming China was incredibly prosperous during the time, and many East Asian innovations were passed on to the rest of the world through the Silk Road, but by and large they lacked the same competitive spirit that drove the Western Europeans in the first place. One of the biggest questions would be whether this would spark a Chinese age of exploration, mirroring what happened in Western Europe after 1492, and whether or not nations like the Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans would be able to or have the motivation to establish overseas colonies in the Americas. And this seems plausible considering North America was incredibly depopulated from diseases even before the arrival of Columbus, although the Pacific Ocean is far larger than the Atlantic, in fact over twice as wide at their widest latitudes. The logistics of this extreme distance would have made overseas American colonies troublesome to administer at first, but tell that to the Portuguese, who created one of the world's first empires that spanned literally every single continent except Antarctica. Despite never showing any real interest in the colonization of their southern neighbors, China did massively influence virtually all of Southeast Asia through culture and genes, so even if Chinese colonies were never established in the New World and the Europeans were the only ones to carve up the continents, the Chinese might still have a massive influence if they arrived there first. It might also be worth mentioning that the Zuni tribe of New Mexico has many remarkable similarities with the Japanese language and has been hypothesized by some to be descendants of ancient Japanese explorers or influenced by them in some way, although again this is largely conjecture and not accepted as plausible by most linguists or historians. As I mentioned in the previous video, the Austronesians were well known as a great seafaring people ever since their exit from Taiwan thousands of years ago, and were in fact so great at traveling the seas, one group from the island of Borneo managed to cross the entire Indian Ocean and ended up in the island of Madagascar, some 4,000 miles away, laying the base for the modern Malagasy people, while other Austronesians spread out over the Pacific as far south as New Zealand and as far east as Easter Island, which is actually closer to mainland South America than it is to most other Polynesian islands. So if the Austronesians were willing to travel half a world away to find a homeland, it is a bit curious as to why they or other Southeast Asian groups would ignore the behemoth of a landmass that was really only a stone's throw away, relatively speaking. Now, Arab traders from the Hadramaut had been traveling the South Asian coast and visiting the Malay archipelago since at least the 8th century, and they left several relics of their presence, such as the noteworthy Arab communities in South and Southeast Asia today, but didn't begin to fully Islamize the Malay region until the 13th century, 500 years later. It could be possible that Arab traders could have reached the Australian mainland, which would have probably been just as disastrous for the Australian Aboriginals as when they made contact with the Europeans, due to the spreading of old world diseases into a gene pool and society completely unequipped to deal with such outbreaks. But perhaps when the dust settled, we would see an Australian society that is a mix of Arabs, Indonesians, and Islamized Aboriginals, or perhaps the Australian Aboriginals would have been Islamized later on by Indonesian sailors, as it is documented that Indonesians were trading with Aboriginals on the northern shore of Australia since at least the 1600s and possibly even the 1400s, a couple centuries before the discovery by the Dutch. When the British would inevitably arrive a few hundred years later, it's unknown how this would affect their policy of colonization and whether or not a full-fledged settler colony would be established, as an Islamized Aboriginal population would without a doubt be even more hostile towards Christian rule. One other equally zany possibility is that the Dutch find not an Islamic Australian society, but a Hindu one. Now, you may think, Mason, you're just grasping at straws at this one, but this is a scenario I actually believe has a bit more merit than what was previously mentioned, as not only is there strong evidence that ancient South Asians may have stumbled across Australia in the past, but Hinduism was also far more widespread not too long ago. DNA tests on modern Australian Aborigines have found that around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, a small group of South Asian sailors came upon the northwest coast of Australia and interacted with the Aboriginals, making small waves in the gene pool, but also introducing the ancestors of what would evolve into the dingo into the Australian outback, where they seem to have little problem making themselves at home. Ancient South Asians had to swim an astonishing 3,000 miles before arriving in Australia, and it may have just been pure chance that this is where they ended up, but if a connection was made between Indian colonists in Australia and the Indian mainland, Hinduism could have easily spread to the region, although most likely these ancient South Asians spoke either a Dravidian or Vedic language, as the Indo-Aryans didn't migrate to the Indian subcontinent until 1500 BC. Additionally, it's not exactly common knowledge, but the bulk of Southeast Asia actually used to be dominated by Hinduism up until Buddhism swept through the region a few hundred years later, and great Hindu kingdoms and empires in Southeast Asia included at one point the Khmer, the Champa, Madang, and of course the Majapahit, who would give birth to the Balinese, who are some of the last surviving native Hindus of Southeast Asia, along with a minority of ethnic Cham people. The island of Bali is actually only around 700 miles away from the Australian coast, so it wouldn't be out of the question for Hindu traders from Southeast Asia to explore Australia and for the Australian Aborigines to convert to Hinduism like the ancient Southeast Asians did. And as for how Hindu Aborigines would interact with Europeans, well, I'll leave that up to your imagination. There are very many situations I didn't discuss involving European colonization, although truthfully most people wouldn't be able to tell you which African, Asian, or other countries around the globe were colonies of which specific European nation. Although my viewers are definitely not most people, and I have no doubt that you guys will give me some fantastic and never before heard of scenarios that'll really blow everyone away, but these are just a few that I thought were the strangest and most interesting to me. And if you believe in the many worlds theory heavily popularized in recent television shows, then theoretically all of these scenarios have occurred somewhere out there in a parallel universe, because according to the theory, any alternate possibility ranging from the smallest change in subatomic particles would create a new timeline. So maybe one day we'd finally get to see those syrup eaters take over the world, although some have argued that free will and human sapience is merely an illusion and that every single action played out by every individual atom has been set in motion since the beginning of time. But we're going deep here. So please let me know, what are the weirdest alternate history scenarios that could have actually happened in the recent or distant past, within reason of course. Thank you all for watching, and thank you all for 1/8 of a million subscribers. That's really an incredible milestone and farther than I thought I'd ever get. So keep your eyes peeled, because I always have something under my sleeves. And I'll see you next time.